Hi, I'm Rick Allen, Senior Director of Flight Operations for Air Canada. Welcome aboard Flight 016, and we're going from Hong Kong to Vancouver. I'd just like to talk a little bit about Just Planes and how I got involved. About 2.5–3 years ago, I had a position at Air Canada called the MFO, which is a manager of flying operations, and my boss at the time, Captain Dave Legg, who's now the Senior Vice President of Operations, had asked me to deal with an email that came from Michael, one of the owners of Just Planes. And what it was, I started looking into it, and here we are 3 hours later. I think they've done, or 3 hours. We are 3 years later, and Just Planes has made 6, maybe 8 flights. And Michael said, I've got to do one over the pole, and I'd like the Senior Director of Flight Operations to do it. Well, after much chagrin, trying to put it off, here we are in September, and we completed 015 yesterday, or correction, 2 days ago, and we are on a return for 016. So, Senior Director of Flight Operations, what that role encompasses is I'm the Chief Pilot Delegate for the airline under the Canadian Air Regulations, which are set by Transport Canada. Every airline has a Chief Pilot. They have an Operations Manager, a Principal Maintenance Inspector, and a Flight Attendant Manager. So for the people out there, I've been asked to sort of give some of my background and how I got interested in aviation. As a kid growing up, my father worked in the airline industry. He worked for an airline called Canadian Pacific Airlines. He was involved in customer service and sales. I have one brother, 2 sisters, and there was 4 young lads, and what we used to do is travel all over the world, flying in a DC-8, usually sitting in the last row, sleeping on the floor, flying for 8, 9, 10 hours. So 3–4 times a year, our family would go around the world as my dad was traveling on business. So as a teenager, when I started showing interest that I wanted to take up some flying, back in the 70s, there was a college out in southeastern British Columbia called Selkirk College, which had a program which was designed specifically for commercial pilots. In Canada, there's approximately 10 accredited flying schools that were available. I was living in Toronto at the time. My folks were out on the West Coast. And I decided to go back to British Columbia and learn how to fly. The college is located in the West Kootenays, beautiful scenarios. You learn how to fly in the mountains. And after 2 years, you graduate with a commercial license, multi-engine, IFR rating. You have approximately 200 hours. And I think over 30 years now, it really hasn't changed. When people are graduating, they have the same challenges that most aspiring pilots had back in the 70s, is finding that first job. And in fact, in any industry, it's pretty tough to land that first job. So I hit the highway and stopped at probably every airport in British Columbia trying to find a job with 200 hours. Very difficult back then, and it's still very difficult now. As I was heading east across the country, I landed in Edmonton, and I figured, well, I still hadn't found a job, and to keep going any further east, especially in the country of Canada, you need a float plane rating. So there's a little lake called Cooking Lake just to the outside of Edmonton, and back in the spring of '79, it only cost $250 then for 5 hours flying. It was in an old Aranca to get your float rating. So from there, I ended up getting a job almost the following week once I had a rating, and it was a company up in Fort Chipewyan, which is in the northeast corner of Alberta, right on the border of Northwest Territories and Saskatchewan. And my first job was flying a 185 on floats. Then most people, when they find a job up in northern Canada, the goal is to slowly come back to civilization and head south. After the float season, about halfway through the summer, I ended up finding a job in Fort McMurray. Back in 1979, Air Canada, CP Air, Pacific Western, Nordair, everybody was doing a lot of hiring at the time. So it was almost coming to an end of a peak, but what happened, it created a vacancy in Fort McMurray where some young guy just landed a job that which created an opening. So quickly I packed the bags down to Fort McMurray and spent the fall and early winter there flying a Cessna 206, 207, and a 182 on wheels and skis. Shortly after that, it was coming up to the fall of '79, I ended up landing a job in Calgary. There was an opening for a company flying, it was called Southern Frontier Airlines. And in November of '79, I spent approximately 5 years with this company. They had almost every airplane under the sun. I started flying in a right seat of a light twin Cessna 402, and it was on what we call a bag run. A lot of companies there had contracts with the different bags flying around their data to different airports, picking it up in the morning and taking them home at night. Well, 3 or 4 years in there, quickly after about 3 or 4 months flying in the right seat of a Cessna 402, developing that experience, we're promoted to captain, flying the bag run. And that typically was a departure at 6 in the morning, land somewhere at an airport at 8:30. Once the banking day was over, the Loomis trucks would come back at 17:30 at night, depart at about 1800 and get back to your base in Calgary at 2000. And that was a 5-day-a-week job. About 6 months after that, about a year into it, with a little bit more experience, you also started flying right seat in turbine aircraft. So I was flying in a King Air. Uniform Alpha Charlie. I can remember that first one because it was a test aircraft for United Aircraft Corp as they're doing engine tests on it. A few months after that, a little bit more experience in the turbine aircraft. It was promotion to a captain on the King Air. This company had lots of different aircraft. I ended up flying, let's count the aircraft, Cessna 402, Cessna 310, Navajo, Twin Otter, DC-3, and the last aircraft I flew there was a Convair 440. So in the early 80s in Canada, the industry started to take one of their dives. About 1980-81, the airline stopped hiring. But for a young, aspiring individual that wanted to build time, it was a great place to work. A few years in, we were bought out by a company called Time Air. It was a regional airline based in Lethbridge, Alberta. And basically it was a tier 3 airline providing service for the province. We merged into that group. We could call that the first merger that I was ever involved in. And the position that I ended up taking was the captain on a Convair 580 out of Calgary. And that lasted 2 years until the industry started picking up, where I ended up at Air Canada. So I started in Air Canada 25 years ago and was hired in the spring of 1986. And the way the career progressed there is that we were hired on as a second officer on a Boeing 727. At Air Canada, the collective agreement with the Air Canada Pilots Association, most positions are determined by seniority and what you can bid, what you can hold. I lasted about 3 years as a second officer on a Boeing 727. Then I was promoted to on the DC-9. I flew in the right seat as a first officer for approximately 2 years. And then we had some new technology aircraft that arrived at Air Canada. And we received our first Airbuses in the very early 1990-91. So I bid from the right seat of a DC-9 to the right seat of a 320. And from there, flew that for about 2 years. And then the economy and the airline industry started to take another dive. My father used to say, you know, being in the marketing and sales end of it, is that the airline industry was very cyclic, and you could almost base it every 7 years. 1979, I graduated from flying college. 7 years after that, I was hired by Air Canada. 7 years after that, I was furloughed, laid off. Air Canada hadn't laid off in 30, 40 years. I think they had laid off in 1962. 7 years after that, I was promoted to captain on an Airbus. 7 years after that, I was asked to come into the management. So let's call that the 7-year itch. And at the time, the Vice President of Flight Operations, Captain Dave Legge, was promoted to, as I said earlier, the Senior Vice President of Operations. Shortly after that, about 2 weeks later, David asked me if I wanted to take the position on as the Senior Director for Flight Operations. And of course, I thought about it over the weekend, discussed it with the family, and here we are. We're about 2.5 years into the job. I'm absolutely loving it. We're looking forward to the future. 787s are coming, hopefully some new destinations, and we'll see what Air Canada brings. So to wind this up, I'd just like to talk about the relationship between Air Canada and Just Planes. It's been a phenomenal opportunity for, I think, both Just Planes and Air Canada, as we started back in '09 working on some films. I think Udo started with 001. I think was the first one we did going across to Tokyo. We've done 330s. We've done South America. This summer they just did what I call the narrow body Atlantic crossing. So we have the polar route, which we're doing today. That was very exciting for Just Planes. And I don't know what else is next in their I don't know what's next in their sights. I'm sure they're looking forward to that 787, just like everybody at Air Canada is. So on behalf of Air Canada and Just Planes, thank you for joining us.